You've probably heard the story. A mining tunnel collapses in Idaho, and out spill tools older than anything in the textbooks. It's a great story. It's also not true. The real site is quieter and far stranger, a narrow river terrace where the Salmon River cuts through solid rock, where archaeologists dug for a decade and found stone points dating back 16,000 years. 3,000 years before Clovis, the culture American schools have taught for generations as the first Americans. For 50 years, one theory explained exactly how humans reached this continent. This discovery says that theory couldn't have worked at all. For most of the 20th century, that theory had a name, Clovis first. It said the earliest Americans crossed a land bridge out of Siberia, then walked south through a corridor that opened between two collapsing ice sheets, carrying a signature spear point so distinctive it became a kind of calling card. Fluted, symmetrical, deadly efficient. A blade with a channel cut into its base so it could be lashed to a wooden shaft and driven into the ribs of a mammoth. Clovis points turn up in kill sites and museum vitrines, from Montana to Mexico, and for decades, if you dated a site to anything older than roughly 13,000 years, the burden of proof landed on you, not on the theory. Clovis first wasn't just an archaeological model. It was the closest thing American prehistory had to an origin story. One people, one route, one clean beginning, printed in textbooks as settled fact. Then a patch of dirt in Idaho refused to cooperate. The site sits where Rock Creek meets the lower Salmon River at the bottom of a canyon almost a kilometer deep, basalt walls rising on both sides, carved by a river that has been cutting through that rock since long before anyone was alive to watch it happen. Brutal heat in summer, hard cold in winter. Salmon runs thick enough to have made this terrace worth defending, worth returning to, generation after generation. Nothing about it looks like a monument. No gold, no temple, no grand facade rising out of the dust. Just river silt and wind-blown loess, stacked in layers like pages nobody had finished reading. And underneath those pages, something waiting to force an entire discipline to rewrite its opening chapter. The story of those pages actually starts in 1961, when archaeologist B. Robert Butler cut a trench into that terrace and pulled out a handful of strange stemmed points. Small, sharp, almost surfboard-shaped, nothing like Clovis's fluted blades. Butler dug 3 separate seasons through 1964, recording the layers carefully, bagging what he found, drawn back again and again by artifacts that didn't fit the accepted script. But the radiocarbon technology of that era needed large samples to produce a usable date, and the material in his trench was too sparse, too fragmentary to test with any confidence. He noted the anomaly in his field reports. He couldn't prove it. Eventually, the trench was backfilled and left, and for over 3 decades, that discovery just sat there in storage boxes, filed as interesting, unresolved, and quietly forgotten by almost everyone outside a small circle of specialists. In 1997, a doctoral student named Lauren Davis reopened a small corner of the site, digging a single 2x2 meter unit for his own research. What he found in that first look was already uncomfortable. A buried pit, later labeled Feature A2, packed with 4 stemmed points and other worked stone, radiocarbon dating to somewhere around 13,000 years, old enough to rival Clovis on its own terms, old enough to make other archaeologists take notice. That should have been the headline. It wasn't even close to the real story. Davis came back with Oregon State University and the Bureau of Land Management for a full decade, from 2009 to 2018, opening 2 separate excavation zones on the terrace, labeled simply Area A and Area B. Starting in 2017, his crew included interns and students from the Nez Perce tribe, working the same soil their ancestors once walked. To the Nez Perce, none of this ground was a mystery waiting to be solved. It's Nipehi, an ancestral village tied to oral tradition that stretches back long before anyone arrived with a trowel, a story still told today of a village destroyed by catastrophic flooding and rebuilt by the survivors who returned to this exact terrace. Cultural director Nakia Williamson Cloud would later put it bluntly, his people were never absent from this place, so a scientist finding it wasn't a revelation. It was overdue confirmation of something they'd known all along. But as Davis's team dug deeper into the lowest layer, something started happening that wasn't supposed to happen. The dates kept getting older. Davis has admitted, on the record, that he didn't believe the first numbers. 14,000 years from the bottom layer, old enough to make him suspicious of his own lab equipment, his own methods, his own eyes. So he ran the samples again, then again. The dates didn't move. Every retest came back the same, stubbornly, uncomfortably old. That alone should have set off alarms in the archaeological community. It did, for a different reason. The soil in that lowest layer was riddled with old rodent burrows, tunnels chewed through the wind-blown dust over thousands of years by ground squirrels, quietly dragging younger material downward into older sediment, one tiny, displaced fragment at a time. It's nearly invisible to the naked eye, a kind of slow-motion contamination working underground for millennia, undetectable until someone thinks to look for it. If a single younger artifact had slipped down one of those tunnels and settled at the bottom, the whole find could be an illusion, a false ancient date wearing the mask of a real one. And there was a second worry buried in the same layer. Freshwater shellfish, like the mussels found alongside the points, can absorb old dissolved carbon straight out of river water, returning radiocarbon dates that look centuries or even millennia older than the animal actually was when it died. Before Davis could trust a single mussel shell date, his team had to test living mussels pulled straight out of the modern Salmon River, proving the water itself wasn't quietly lying to the lab, feeding false age into every shell that grew inside it. So instead of leaning on a handful of promising numbers, Davis's team went wide, stacking one dating method on top of another until the margins for error had nowhere left to hide. They ran accelerator mass spectrometry radiocarbon dating, some of it processed through the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit in England on charcoal, animal bone, and shell, then cross-checked those results against optically stimulated luminescence, a method that measures the last moment buried quartz grains ever saw sunlight before they were sealed underground in total darkness. 94 separate shell dates alone went into the final model. Then they folded everything into a Bayesian statistical framework, essentially forcing dozens of independent clocks, river sediment, animal bone, burnt wood, and buried quartz to agree with each other before a single date was allowed to stand as evidence. The result, published in the journal Science in 2019, was hard to explain away. The model placed the start of that lowest layer between roughly 16,500 and 15,300 years ago, not one lucky sample from one lucky test. A repeated, cross-checked, stubbornly consistent pattern buried under a fossilized ground surface archaeologists now call the Rock Creek soil, sandwiched between alternating bands of river flooding and wind-blown loess, each layer a page in a calendar written slowly by the canyon itself, one flood and one dust storm at a time for thousands of years. That date mattered even more because of what else researchers had just discovered, nearly 3,000 kilometers to the north. Scientists studying the so-called ice-free corridor, the exact route Clovis first said the earliest Americans walked south through, between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, pulled ancient sedimentary DNA and fossil pollen straight out of lake bottom cores buried along that path. Their findings, published separately in the journal Nature, were blunt. Even after the glaciers pulled back and the ground was technically exposed, the corridor stayed a lifeless strip of gravel and meltwater for thousands of years. No grass, no game, nothing capable of sustaining travelers on foot until roughly 12,600 years ago, at the very earliest. In a companion study using ancient bison DNA to track when large animals could finally survive the route, pushed that number even later. Read that again. People were already living on a terrace in Idaho, 3,000 years before the only road the textbooks describe could have fed a single traveler crossing it. That doesn't just weaken the old story. It leaves a harder, colder question standing in its place, uncomfortable and unresolved. If they didn't walk in through the ice, how did anyone get here at all? One answer had been sitting on the edge of mainstream archaeology for years, mostly dismissed as speculation with no proof behind it. Researchers call it the Kelp Highway, first formally proposed in 2007, described by one of its own authors as the deliberate antithesis of the old corridor route. The idea is that early people moved south along the Pacific coastline itself, following dense kelp forests thick with fish, shellfish, seals, and sea otters, using boats to work their way down a coast that has since drowned beneath rising seas. Almost none of that coastline survives to be excavated today. It's underwater, buried by 10,000 years of melting glacial ice, sunk beneath the waves that swallowed the beaches people once walked. Under this model, the Columbia River, which the salmon feeds directly into, would have been the first place travelers could turn inland off the open ocean. Cooper's Ferry sits almost exactly on that turn, upstream, tucked into the canyon like a doorway nobody had noticed was there. And then there's the detail that still gets archaeologists shouting at conferences. Those lowest stemmed points don't resemble anything in the Clovis toolkit. They resemble stemmed points recovered from late Upper Paleolithic sites in Hokkaido, Japan, and from Ushki, on the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia's far east, a shared design stretching almost the entire rim of the Pacific Ocean, from one continent to another. Davis floated the implication carefully, never claiming more than the evidence allowed. Maybe this wasn't coincidence. Maybe it was people, or at least ideas, moving down a coastline no one had yet proven they were capable of traveling at all. Not everyone accepted it, and the pushback wasn't quiet. In 2020, a formal rebuttal published in the journal Paleo America, co-authored by researchers including Stuart Fiedel and Ben Potter, laid out a direct challenge to nearly every part of the claim. The rodent burrows made the lowest layer unreliable, they argued, no matter how many samples were tested. The Japanese points being compared were actually too young to be ancestral to anything found at Cooper's Ferry, the chronology running backward from what Davis needed it to show. And genetically, the modern populations descended from that Jomon-era Japanese culture are only distantly related to Native Americans, a gap that, in their view, undercut the entire coastal migration comparison before it even got started. Their conclusion was blunt and unforgiving. Real demonstrated occupation at Cooper's Ferry probably didn't begin until around 11,500 years ago, safely back inside the Clovis era, after all. Ben Potter, an archaeologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, would later tell reporters the site was intriguing but not paradigm shifting, a polite way of saying he wasn't convinced. Other researchers raised separate doubts about the dental and skeletal evidence some scientists had used to link Pacific Rim populations that far back in time. Davis didn't back down. He called the critique riddled with factual errors and invented attributions, a public and pointed rejection between two camps who both had their reputations riding on the outcome. Then in 2022, his team answered not with argument, but with more dirt. A second paper, this time built entirely on Area B, a separate excavation zone, dozens of meters from the first, dug specifically to test whether the original results could survive independent scrutiny. It produced 16 more complete or fragmentary stemmed points, tied directly to animal bone dated inside sealed, undisturbed pit features that no rodent burrow had ever touched, with more than 65,000 individual items mapped to the millimeter across both areas combined. It was a direct answer to the burrowing soil argument, engineered specifically to remove the ambiguity critics had pointed to. It didn't end the fight. It made the easy dismissal a great deal harder to make with a straight face. That fight still hasn't closed. As of the most recent published research, Davis and his critics still disagree on exactly what that lowest layer proves, and neither side has walked away from the argument. That's not a flaw in this story. That is the story, a live scientific dispute, still unresolved, still playing out across journal pages over a patch of dirt almost no one outside archaeology will ever walk on or even hear about. Cooper's Ferry isn't alone in causing this kind of trouble either. Monte Verde, in southern Chile, broke the Clovis-only consensus back in the 1990s, and even that discovery has never stopped generating debate, with new reanalyses still arguing over exactly how old its deepest layer really is. Paisley Caves in Oregon added ancient human DNA to the pile, recovered from fossilized human waste sealed in dry cave sediment for thousands of years. The Buttermilk Creek site in Texas pushed a separate, independent date back to roughly 15,500 years, using its own stone tool technology, unrelated to anything found in Idaho. And in 2021, human footprints preserved in gypsum mud at White Sands, New Mexico, were dated using ancient seed pollen, then independently reconfirmed in 2023 using a completely different dating method, and again in 2025 using Paleo Lake sediment tested by an unrelated laboratory with no stake in the outcome. 55 separate radiocarbon dates across 3 different kinds of material, all landing in the same window, roughly 21,000 to 23,000 years ago. One researcher on that project put it simply, it would take extraordinary coincidence for that many independent tests to all be wrong in exactly the same direction. Any single one of these sites, on its own, could be waved off as an outlier, a fluke, a mistake waiting to be corrected. Stacked together across 4 different countries and 3 different dating techniques, they start to look like a pattern the old model can no longer absorb without breaking. There's a real cost to admitting that, and it isn't only academic. Careers were built defending Clovis first. Entire departments organized around it. Textbooks were printed with a single clean arrow on the map, a single clean date underneath it, easy to teach and easy to test. Every new pre-Clovis site is, in a small way, a threat to that consensus, which is exactly why the pushback has been so fierce, so public, and so slow to resolve. Nobody wants to be the last person still teaching a route that, according to the sediment itself, never actually opened in time to matter. For the Nez Perce tribe, none of it ever felt like a revelation in the first place. It felt like the rest of the world finally catching up to something they'd never lost. Williamson Cloud has said plainly that his people have always been in this place, that Cooper's Ferry isn't some nameless prehistoric campsite waiting to be identified and named by outsiders, but Napehe, a village their ancestors founded, lost, and returned to, never fully separate from the people who still live in the region today. Science spent 60 years arguing over a timeline the Nez Perce never needed proof for in order to believe it. Their consultation shaped the excavation from the beginning, and their own students dug the final seasons alongside university crews, not as observers standing at the edge of the trench, but as participants confirming a history they'd always carried, and soil their families never stopped calling home. Today, the excavation is finished. The pits are backfilled, sealed back under the same silt and loess that hid them for 16,000 years. The ground closed over once again like a wound left to heal. Where archaeologists once knelt in the dirt for a decade, mapping tens of thousands of fragments to the millimeter, there's now a quiet interpretive sign on a Bureau of Land Management access road above the canyon. Easy to miss if you're not looking for it. Easy to drive past without knowing what's beneath your wheels. A single stemmed point pulled from that dig sits under glass in a small museum in Cottonwood, Idaho. A sliver of worked stone no longer than a human thumb, small enough to overlook, sharp enough to have once meant the difference between eating and starving, and old enough, depending on which archaeologist you ask, to have either buried the old theory for good or to still not have finished the job. There was no mining tunnel, no dramatic collapse No lucky accident spilling ancient tools into daylight for someone to stumble on. Just a river terrace, giving up one layer at a time over 60 years, forcing an entire discipline to admit its cleanest story might have been wrong from the start. The ice-free corridor isn't dead. It's simply no longer the only road in, and the fight over what replaces it is still being fought in journals, in labs, and in university offices. Nowhere near settled, nowhere near quiet. Somewhere under that silent Idaho terrace, sealed back beneath dust and river silt, the next contradiction may already be waiting in the dark. Patient, undisturbed. Nobody has gone back to look yet.